Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman Podcast.
Because if you say there's a difference, that means there's one single defining thing that's a characteristic that one group of people have and another don't. It tends to be differences.
Hello Sales Nation, I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman Podcast, as always, and welcome to today's show. On today's episode, we have the legend that is Anthony Iannarino, and I'm asking him, do we need to have had a huge amount of adversity in our lives to be able to parlay that into a huge amount of motivation? You can find out more about Anthony over at thesalesblog.com. And with that all said, let's jump into today's episode. Hey Anthony, and welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
It's good to be back.
I'm glad to have you back on. I didn't mention this in the pre-intro conversation. I did not jot it down to mention it, but I did it's totally off topic, as this is the worst intro to any show I've ever done. But on the last show, I did a blog post that followed up from this, talking about how I stopped drinking after our conversation and a few other things and focused down my peer group, and I took a lot away from our conversation last time. And that post has been viewed over 100,000 times now on the blog. So yeah, there's no pressure here.
I was going to say, you're setting the bar kind of high today. What else do we have to work on while we're together?
Yeah, so there's no pressure with this one, but that kind of, that's the emphasis, and that's what I took away from the last episode. And so I'm sure we're going to have an interesting conversation today as well. And today's conversation...
You feel good?
I feel good. I'm pumped. I'm excited. I've been looking forward to having you back on for a while, and clearly this coincides with your book launch, which we'll talk about at the end of the show. But the topic of today's conversation is essentially the difference, if there is one, between the top salespeople that really succeed and those that are perhaps in that middle grey area of like doing okay, just plodding along. And I see this in the people that email me. So I get hundreds of emails every month from listeners of the show. The elite, as I call them, the top sales professionals that don't really come to me asking for help. They kind of thank me for the show and what we put out more than anything else. They use a totally different set of language. They have seemingly different beliefs, and just their confidence over email is palatable, noticeable, versus those that come to me asking for help, motivation, that kind of thing, which obviously I email everyone back and do my best bit. But where I want to start with all this is there a clear-cut difference between that top kind of 5% of sales professionals and everyone else? Or is it a grey area that kind of scales up and is there success on a sliding scale?
I don't think that there's a difference, because if you say there's a difference, that means there's one single defining thing that's a characteristic that one group of people have and another don't. It tends to be differences. There tends to be multiple things. First, I want to go back and talk about your emails, though. So it's interesting to me the way that you framed that up, because here's what I recognize from what I see salespeople do and from the emails that I get. The people who are already killing it, they send me emails to confirm that what I'm writing is exactly what they believe, and it's how they operate, and it's why they believe they're successful. So that's the first group. The second group is the group that's confused by all of this and sends letters saying, I'm really struggling in this area or that area. But what's interesting is over time, if you go back and look at those emails, those people start to do better because of what they're learning by listening to your podcast and my podcast and reading the blogs and reading all the other people who are producing content. And over time, they start to send the notes saying, thank you, this really helped me, I'm doing better. And I get tons of emails that say, I made my number because of you, I didn't lose my job. And really, it wasn't me that did anything for them. If I was, I'll take 0.1% of the credit for that. It's that they started doing the work that they needed to do, and they were studying and they were reading. So I think what you see is you'll see people that write to you at one point in time get better because they are thinking about it and studying. And that tends to be one of the differences you see between high performers and low performers, is people who are trying to perform better, they're reading, they're listening, they're studying. When they're in the car on the way to a sales call, they're listening to your podcast on the way, and they probably tell you that when they're writing to you. I listen to you in the car, and that sort of sets my mind. Those are the people who are actually making an effort. And almost invariably, if you put an effort, and it doesn't really matter who you are, if you put an effort and focus on one area and you continue to just chip away at that area, eventually all the obstacles give way to your persistence. And so you start to do better. So I think it's interesting. You can see them in the emails and you can categorize them, but they're going to change. And what I've done with the book is made a list of attributes, which are beliefs and behaviors that I've seen, and skills to sort of say, when people say that salesperson sucks, they're a terrible salesperson, they don't know how to close. And then I'll look at that salesperson and say, they don't have any problem asking for commitments. They're not resourceful and they're not self-disciplined. Those are the two real obstacles that this person has. But it tends to be a whole bunch of different factors where high performers have a better grasp on those things. So they have a stronger mindset and stronger skill sets. And lower performers, or people who are especially just starting out, they don't have all that yet.
We'll come to the skills and discipline, something I want to touch on as well, because I think that's super important here. And we'll come on to that in a second. But perhaps we need to take a step back of all of this, because my audience, and perhaps your audience as well, is probably really skewed in the sales industry of, for me especially, if you're listening to a sales podcast every day, you're self-aware enough that there's room to improve, that you're taking that first step in downloading free content and listening to it and consuming it, that you're probably ahead of the game already, perhaps, or you're on this curve of growth and success that you described then. So taking a step back from perhaps where we started and looking at the industry as a whole, is that the first step to becoming more successful as a sales professional, to just become self-aware of where you're good and perhaps where you're weak?
That is the first step. It's awareness. And I don't think that salespeople are aware. I mean, it's very hard to do the kind of introspective work that you need to be really aware of your flaws. And there's a lot of people that talk. I mean, I love Gary Vaynerchuk, but he says, forget about your weaknesses, just focus on your strength. As an entrepreneur, that's great. If you're a visionary, you hire somebody who can execute to be that balance for you. But as an individual, your weaknesses will kill you. I mean, it doesn't work. If you have no self-discipline, saying don't worry about your lack of self-discipline, just focus on the fact that you have really high business acumen. Well, your business acumen will never help you because you never are in front of anybody because you're not disciplined enough to nurture and prospect and do these things. You've got to shore up the weaknesses, and the awareness is where it starts. And I don't think that a lot of salespeople, and I know that their companies aren't aware of all the different areas where you have to really have some high competency as a salesperson, like resourcefulness and initiative and accountability. And if they do, they have this competency model that they will have on paper for HR, but then no one will ever deal with the salesperson using that competency model. It'll be like, well, I hired them to sell. They said they knew how to sell when they got here. They should be out selling right now. That's what they should be doing, and they're not doing it. It's more complicated than that. There's a whole bunch of factors, and you have to sort of look at it. But it's the awareness that lets you say, I recognize I have a gap. And even if you don't know what that gap is, if you're out listening to podcasts, if you're reading blog posts, you're going to see something that's going to make you immediately say, wait a second, this feels like they're writing to me, or it feels like they're talking about me. I do this thing that they're saying you shouldn't be doing. And that's when salespeople start to have that mindset shift, or any people when you're going through change. It's first the awareness that something needs to be improved. And then once you start to make that shift, and I'm aware and I'm going to do something different, the results follow.
So I want to get really practical with this, because we could talk for hours. We could essentially just talk through the book, and there'd be like days worth of content to go at. So I want to get practical, and I want to narrow things down as much as we can, so that people listen to the show at the end of it have got a clear focus of what they need to think about and improve upon. So from what you just discussed then, Anthony, which is more important? Which has the best bang for buck in general? Improving where you're weak, or perhaps doubling down and not dismissing where you're weak, but doubling down on where you're good? If you had one area, or if you had kind of one slot of upgradability, would you put it where you're weak, or would you put it where you're already successful?
If you're already successful, you don't need to pay attention to that. I would shore up the weakness. I wouldn't let the weakness destroy my results. And that's typically what happens when you look at sales performance, or look at performance in any human endeavor. If you're weak in an area, that's the part that's preventing you from reaching, a world-class status or being best in class. It's not the strength. If you're already strong, why would you worry about that? You're already good there. And in some cases, you need to be what might be considered like the minimal viable, acceptable level. So you're not the most self-disciplined person on earth. Okay, maybe you don't have to be, but you have to be better than you are now on a few things. And so that kind of thing makes a difference. Or maybe your attitude, you recognize that it's not what you need it to be. Getting that to the point where it's no longer a problem for you can help solve other issues for you. So I don't think that I would tell anybody, and this is counter to what everybody hears out there right now, like, don't worry about your weaknesses. Worry a lot about your weaknesses. Worry about it. If you're not good at communicating, you need to be a good communicator. All these things matter. So you have to get it up to a level that it's acceptable. And I would say get rid of those weaknesses.
Okay, and so to narrow it down even further, so we know we need to focus now on the weaknesses rather than success. Which is, again, the biggest bang for buck, and then we'll drill into very practical applications for all of this in a second, but which has the biggest bang for buck? Working on your beliefs, your behaviors, or specific sales skills?
I put this in a particular order. I think it's mindset, skill set, toolkit. And right now, the industry basically says toolkit. You need a sales stack.
And why is that? I've got an opinion which I'll share in a minute, but why do you think that is?
Because it's easy to think that the technology is going to make up for all the lacking of a salesperson, and that technology is the problem. So people have a sales stack with 14 different software programs in it. First off, that's too many, by the way. So we're way overdone on that. And who are you giving the tools to? That's the most important thing. Who's the real tool that you have is the rep, or if you are the rep, what's between your ears is the real area that you need to work on. I would say mindset comes first. And I've had this argument with people. If I had somebody who was a great salesperson, when you look at all the skills, they can prospect, they can close, they've got business acumen, they've got leadership abilities, but they have a terrible mindset. Or I get a person with a rock solid mindset. I mean, an indomitable mind. These are really strong beliefs, behaviors, but they're not good at sales. I take the mindset, because over time, the skills will come. But the mindset is harder to work on than the skill set for most people. The beliefs that we have, we don't even know how we got them. We didn't choose those beliefs. We got infected with the beliefs of people around us and our parents and our managers. You don't even recognize that you took on a pessimistic or a cynical belief system until somebody else points it out to you. So those are the things that really, really hold people back. That's why I think mindset comes before skill set. Get that part right and the skills come easy.
Is it within the scope of a podcast like this, with perhaps 25 minutes left to have the conversation, to dive into the area of mindset? Is it possible to have an impact in that period of time for the audience so they can take something away from this? Sorry to interrupt there, but this is a genuine, open and honest question, because the audience will know I don't like kind of just talking around the subject. I like real practical. I like them to be able to take something away from it. Otherwise, there's little point in listening. It's just procrastination at that point, isn't it?
It is absolutely possible for anyone listening to this podcast to change right now, just like that. It's that fast. All you have to do is make a decision, like you did after our last podcast. You made a decision. You said, I'm going to act on what I learned today because I think it's going to serve me. And it's turned out that it has served you well and it was worth doing. But you can change immediately. And we can share a number of ideas in 25 minutes that would help people produce better results right now and potentially change their life if they're aware and if they're willing to do the work.
How do we get people to change immediately? So I'm a fan of Tony Robbins. He talks about this angle of, I can't remember the specific quote, but essentially it takes years to get to the point of making a decision. But as you said then, the decision happens in a second. And what I take away from what he shares is that, and this works for me, if I get really angry about the situation, and clearly I'm not a very angry, aggressive person, but if I force myself to get angry and uncomfortable and to use his language, raise my standards, massive change happens very, very quickly. And this happened with the show very recently with a couple of things that we talked about in episode 215, I think it was. How can we implement this? And is that a legitimate strategy, or are there any other better ways to go about increasing this ability to change in an instant and real kind of mindset shifts? Because I agree with you, that's the foundation of everything that I've had my success with the show in has come from me going, right, I'm not happy with this anymore. And writing it down in a diary every day, kind of all these hacks of productivity, all this kind of stuff, it just doesn't work for me. But as soon as I go, right, I'm not doing that anymore, that is shit. I'm going to do it this way, and I'm angry and passionate about it. It happens.
I don't think you have to be angry. I mean, I think that, and I love Tony's stuff, and I think he's right. People change for one of two reasons: inspiration or desperation, and mostly desperation. It's when they say, I just can't go on this way anymore, that people start to make a shift. But you don't have to wait until you get to that point to say, I can't go on this way anymore. What your job is as a human being, from my view, is to reach your full potential. And no matter where you are right now, I promise you, you're nowhere close to your full potential. No matter how successful you are financially, with happiness, with your marriage, with your work, you're nowhere near your full potential, because it's impossible for a human being to actually reach their full potential. We're capable of so much more than we believe they are. So inspiration works too. I mean, if you say, today I'm going to be better, today I'm going to do this because I want to develop my full potential and I want to perform better. I want to take better care of my customers. I want to take better care of my family. I want to be that person that people count on. You can do that right now. You can make that decision right now. You don't have to hit rock bottom. I know it's easier for people to bounce when they hit rock bottom, but you can jump from wherever you are and reach greater heights without having to hit the bottom. There's no reason to do that. You've already got some level of performance. Start where you are and make a decision to do something different. I mean, and you can do that now. There's no reason to wait to do that.
And bringing this back to sales for a second, would you say that the super successful people in the industry, the people who are really thriving, have perhaps gone for a process like this? And the reason I ask is I was going back and forth with a guy. He lost both his parents when he was young and had all these horrible things happen to him. And he says it publicly over these emails with me. He says it very openly that he uses all that resolve to push himself and to make real change in his life. And he only has to think back to where, because he's had loads of terrible things happen to him, but he only has to look back to where he's been miserable to know that he's never going to go back there again, to then push forward through all this.
Yeah, that's more of the using a negative event and framing it in a positive way, which is what most people don't do. They take the negative event and they say, I can't succeed because this thing happened to me. And then you have to say, that's fine, you can believe that, but there are countless people who had exactly the same circumstances that you've had that decided that that's why they succeeded. And it's simply a decision that we make as human beings. Do we rationalize our inaction and our lack of motivation by saying this bad thing happened one time, so now I can't be successful? Or do you use it to say, this one thing happened to me, so now I'm going to be successful? It's just a decision. And human beings are funny this way. We like to absolve ourselves of responsibility. And it starts when we're little children and we do something wrong and we're told, you did that, and then I don't want to feel that feeling anymore. But now you're a grown up and you're driving in your car and you're listening to this. You're 100% accountable for the results you produce in your life. No one else has anything to do with that. It's all 100% up to you, what you do and how you approach these things.
Is that a gap between the top 1% of salespeople and the people who aren't as successful as what they are? This ability to take full responsibility for everything that happens, both personal life and with customers and prospects as well?
Well, there's two pieces to that. One is the viewpoint. Do you have an optimistic viewpoint? And a lot of us don't have that optimistic default setting. So you have to do a lot of work to get rid of the negativity. But if you have an optimistic default setting, or you build that optimism yourself, high performers believe that they're going to succeed. They believe that there's a way. They believe that there might be obstacles, but the obstacles are not insurmountable. That's what they believe. Low performers tend to believe it's my territory, it's my product, it's my competitors, it's my sales manager. I didn't have a good education. That person's better than I am. They had a better start. They have lower pricing. All these things that they tell themselves, that's really an excuse for growing and being better. But optimists tend to think, well, I can find a way through. And the second thing is high performers are accountable. I mean, they take accountability for what they do and what they sell, and they own it themselves. They understand that their success is individual, not situational, and that they have the ability to impact things. And low performers tend to say, you know what, my company screwed this up. It wasn't me, it was my company, and thinking that gets them off the hook for the poor performance of their company. But they tend to refuse to be accountable. And that's sort of what you're saying, like, this bad thing happened to me, so now I can't succeed. We have this funny story we tell as speakers. I've got the brain surgery story. of having a grand mal seizure while I'm fronting a metal band in LA. And, I got to go back to Columbus. I got a piece of my brain cut off. And in the speaker world, the speaker that gets on stage and says, I lost my family. I lost my parents. I've got cancer. My dog died. And then all the rest of the speakers in the room go, why does all the good stuff happen to him? Because it's this great story of overcoming these obstacles that all of us, that's a story we want to hear. We want to hear the story about boy meets girl, boy falls in love with girl, boy loses girl. Now it gets interesting. Something happened. That's the story that we live. But high performers see that story as, oh, that's just the obstacle. On the other side, I got a great story. I can do it.
And so I was brought up like really well, no struggles, no pressures really. My parents were really good until my mum passed away recently. They were still together. And until recently, when I started looking at all of this, because I'm being asked to speak all the time, which is interesting why you said this. And I have a bit of coaching at the moment. And essentially the coaching was find some stories to share that show struggle and how you can relate that back and people enjoy this kind of conversation. But until I very purposefully, for the act of doing more speaking gigs in the future, looked into my past and dove in and had other people's opinions on what works and what wouldn't work as a story, I assumed I had a pretty boring kind of like upbringing because it was just so not perfect, that'd be the wrong way to describe it, but so normal and just succinct, and it worked. For other people in this kind of scenario who are listening to this now and going, well, I didn't really have anything bad happen. I've just plodded along, got into sales, hit target pretty much every year. I'm doing okay, but they want to take that next step, that next level up. Should they be looking back at their own past, their own stories, and perhaps reframing a couple of things to put it in a more positive light, to get more excited about it? Is that a tool that we could use perhaps to change our mindset with all of this?
How old are you, Will?
I'm 29.
Yeah, that's great. I have a son who's 18, and when we were filling out his college applications, you always want to write this great story of adversity and what you've overcome on your way to college. And his story was going to be, he went to Wendy's to get lunch and they put cheese on his hamburger when he asked them not to, because that was like the most adversity he experienced in his young life from his view. And I've told my children, and you're probably much like this, is that the adversity that you have in some cases is not having enough adversity. And I had tremendous adversity, and I love that I had adversity, and I wish my kids had more adversity. I mean, I feel like they need more. You need to be challenged. So you have a couple choices. Either life can hand you adversity, or you can just create the adversity yourself. And you can say, I have a new standard for myself. I'm not going to make my number. I'm going to make 4 times what is required of me from quota. Okay, and then go tell people that. Write it down. Tell people, I've committed to this now. And then struggle with yourself. If you don't have adversity, make it up. I mean, I'm working very hard on a book sale right now because I want a best-selling book. And I don't need a best-selling book. I just want one. So I'm pushing myself to say, who do I have to be to do this? What changes do I need to make in my life to do that? You have to keep growing. And the reason that people get stagnant and bored and complacent and neglectful is they don't have enough adversity. If you can make your number, that's what your company told you needed to do. What do you think you need to do? What do you want to do for your family, for the people that you take care of? What standard of living do you want? You got to answer those questions for yourself. It doesn't have to be in the past. It can be about who are you going to be in the future. And that's a good question for you to ask. And I would tell you, not enough people sit down and actually think about who they want to be. I can tell you this because you're 29. You will be a very different person at 39. And you will be a very different person after that at 49. You got to look at those decades and decide what are you going to get done and who are you going to be during those time periods, because the time's going to go by whether you do anything or not. I promise you, you'll blink 3 more times and you'll be 39. That's how this works. So set a goal and give yourself the adversity and be very public about this is what I'm trying to do.
So it's crazy you say that. So I left my sales job about 2.5, 3 years or so ago now, and I've changed dramatically. And I obviously don't want to talk about me too much on the show, but it's been a massive shift in speaking to people like yourself and all the other sales experts that have come on the show. If I went back into that role now, I would crush it. It would be so simple. And this is simply because my comfort zone has just grown, even more so than my skill set, anything else. I used to get nervous about speaking with the C-suite in the NHS hospitals that I'd be selling into. And now I've got friends who are in C-suites in bigger companies than the trusts I'd been dealing with. And clearly it is just, and I'm really glad, and I was kind of leading you down this route a little bit, but I'm really glad you framed it like that, Anthony, because I feel like the biggest thing that salespeople can do, and I would never describe it, you described it far more eloquently than I ever could, but this idea of growing your comfort zone makes everything else that you were nervous of just easy and basic. And as you said, if you're not growing, you're not living. If you're just plodding along, what's the point? You might as well just do a less stressful job for less money and just watch Netflix every evening and just live a life like that, as opposed to being in sales and having the opportunity to make more money, to retire early, to do anything like that, which sales gives you the opportunity to. It's just a waste, isn't it?
If your idea of the ideal life is sitting at home watching Netflix, you really need to upgrade your standards. I mean, you really need to massively upgrade your standards. You have one go at this game. I mean, for men, if you're lucky and you're your age right now, probably you're going to live to be between 90 and 100 years old without very much trouble. But that's the one ride you get. I mean, you're getting 100 trips around the sun, give or take, and you're getting an eviction notice. So if you're going to watch Netflix during that time, what you're doing is probably avoiding what you're really here to do. Your purpose and meaning, you were not put on the planet, from my view, to watch Netflix. That's not why you're here. If that's the greatest difference you're going to make in the world, you need to upgrade what you think you're capable of. And I'm full hot on the idea, Will, of potential. And human potential is limitless. There's no problem that human beings have been given a long enough timeline we haven't solved. I mean, 100 years ago, you say put a man on the moon. That's crazy. Now we're going to be putting people on Mars. You know, these things are strictly the limit of our imagination and the limit of how thoughtful and resourceful can we be to applying our best thinking to a certain problem. But you're all potential. I mean, that's what you're made up of. You're a blank slate when you're born that's just full of all of human potential. It's all in you. All you have to decide is what you're going to do against that potential to say, how big can I grow this thing? And I promise you, no matter how big it gets, you're just at the beginning points. Because when you look, you're going to say, now that I'm here, like where you are right now, 3 years ago, you couldn't see where you are now. But now you can say, I'm not even doing half of what I should be doing. I can get twice as far as I am right now because you can see further. You just have to keep climbing and growing the potential so you can see the even greater potential inside you.
What do you say to the person who's listening to this now? They're driving to the next sales meeting. They're thinking, hey, Will, you promised me something practical and actionable from this episode. And all I feel is a bit weird and I feel like I need to have an introspective look at my life. Is that something practical that they've taken away from this?
So far, if you feel weird and you did want to go and think about who you are and what you're doing here, that's a good start. You want to get them more practical stuff?
No, that's what I wanted to achieve with the episode. That feeling for me of going, and that realization, which leads up to the decision that changed my life in multiple episodes. I've talked about it on the show before. There was one point I'd been with this girl who's now my long-term partner, but I'd only been with her about 3 weeks. We went for a drink in a pub. I'd just come back in from losing a big deal. My boss was on my back because the target was like looming that I needed to close for the year. And I just cried in this pub because I was so stressed out. And that was the weird feeling I had for months and months up to that point, culminated in that initial like spark of, right, I'm not doing this anymore. I don't like where I am. And what I was getting at was I was just hoping that anyone who is feeling that weird now can understand the difference and can understand that that weird feeling is, for me personally, and you tell me your thoughts on this, Anthony, but that weird feeling is a good thing for me because it means that there's change on the horizon, perhaps.
It always means that there's change available to you. The question is, are you going to be willing to do something with that feeling when you have it? It's a willingness question. If you're willing to take action, then change is right around the corner and better results are right behind that. I mean, that's always the starting point, is there's something that I don't like about what's going on now and I want something better. And that feeling that you felt in a more stressful way. So you did have some adversity. So that's good. I like that.
But it was brought on myself. It was still, I could have just said, well, I'm getting an easier job. That's what I mean by adversity. And perhaps I'm very optimistic on things, and perhaps I don't see it as adversity when I should.
It is adversity, and either you created that adversity, you created it internally. You can create that adversity yourself, and I think it's important to be able to do that. That's how we grow, is to say, even where I am, even if it's great, even if I'm perfectly comfortable, if you're perfectly comfortable right now, that should make you terribly uncomfortable. If you feel 100% satisfied, you are nowhere near your potential. You're nowhere near it if you're 100% satisfied. If you're 100% satisfied, you have amazing growth in front of you. You have to feel that adversity and that pressure internally to take the next step and raise your game even greater.
Love it. And we're going to wrap up that part of the show, or this part of the show, with that, Anthony. And I've got a couple of questions to ask everyone that comes on. First one, other than your own, which we'll come on to in a second, what is one book or resource that you'd recommend to the Sales and Podcast audience?
One book. I can only pick one book.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, I'm going to go with Fanatical Prospecting by Jeb Blunt, only because so many companies are opportunity starved right now, and so many salespeople are struggling only because they're not creating enough opportunities. That's the one book that if you read it and you follow Jeb's advice, you will be a better prospector if you're disciplined and if you take action, and you will start creating more opportunities, and that will solve so many of your problems.
Definitely. I can literally see it on my sofa there. I'm about 5 pages in as I picked it up this morning. So I'm excited about reading it and getting Jeb on the show as well. Next one, dollar size if possible. What's the biggest deal you've ever closed?
Biggest deal I've ever closed. In a single year, in a revenue year, $10 million. That was a single deal in a revenue year. But I have accounts that have done $70, $80 million with me over time. So over 10 years, I've had $70, $80 million of deals that were won one time, but then sustained over that period of time.
You are, congratulations on this. You are the first person who is given an answer of an account as opposed to a one-time close, which obviously it describes how you go about business, in that you're obviously clearly building long-term relationships, and that's what your focus is. And so I really appreciate that, Anthony. And yeah, virtual pat on the back from me, mate, because no one else has mentioned that. And I thought, when I included this question at the end of each show, that would be something that was a common trait in the people I was speaking with, and clearly it just hasn't been.
Well, it's interesting because my view and my bias on this is that you look at an opportunity and you say, what's the lifetime value of this? What am I supposed to be doing with this company over time? And if you look in one of my businesses, the average time somebody keeps an account is 7 years. We do way better than 7 years in that business. I mean, we have accounts that go back 30 years in that particular business. And that account's probably, if you could total up over that 30 years, $100 million. Mm-hmm. But if you're only looking at the $1 million, you're making a mistake. I mean, you need to look at it and say, what game am I playing? Because $1 million's nice, but $100 million over decades with a deep relationship is much nicer.
Of course it is, for sure, mate. Okay, final one, mate. And I asked this to everyone that comes on the show, and I've asked you before, so it'd be interesting to see if your answers changed from last time. But if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self and offer him one piece of advice, what would that piece of advice be? And it's got to be based around sales.
Around sales. One piece of advice. Fortunately, I don't remember what I said, so I'm not committed to that now, and I can go in a different direction if I want to. The younger version of myself, I did so many things well and so many things wrong. I would go back and tell myself this. I would say, you're not selling something to somebody. You're asking them to change. And so what do they have to have from you to be 100% comfortable to committing to the change that you're asking them to make? Because the change that you're asking them to make is easy for you to say and hard for them to execute. And you need to take a greater account into stepping into their shoes and feeling their perspective of how scary this change is and how complicated it's going to be.
Cool. And just to follow up from that, what is the one weakness that you've worked on, which we touched on in the middle of the show? What is the one weakness that you've worked on over the years that you feel has had the biggest impact in improving your game?
When I read Neil Rackham's Spin Selling in the early 90s, that book had been out for 5 or 6 years. and I read Major Account Sales Strategy after that, I took one single thing away from that. And it's not the spin model. That's interesting, but not the most interesting thing. The most interesting thing is the 3 pages leading up to the model, where Rackham explains that salespeople that were succeeding gained a commitment that advanced the sale, and salespeople that were failing gained a continuation, which is we'll talk again at some time in the future. And as soon as I read that, I thought to myself, I will never leave an appointment without having another appointment set that moves the sale forward. That's the only change I made at that time. I started to understand implications because I was working with business people and I started asking implication questions. But just that one change allowed me to immediately produce better results because I just linked commitments together, and that's never failed me.
Amazing. Appreciate that. And with all of that, Anthony, tell us a little bit about the book, and then tell us a little bit about the blog and where we can find that as well, because there's a ton of great content there.
Which book? I'm just kidding. My book. It's the only sales guide you'll ever need. It's number 1 and number 2 in hot new releases as we're recording this right now on Amazon.com. And it's number 4 on Barnes & Noble out of all of their books. It's in the top 100. I'm right in front of Bruce Springsteen, which is absolutely insane. And that's sure to reverse itself any minute, I'm sure, because he's the boss. So the book is basically, it's a framework and it's a competency model. There are 9 attributes in the first half of the book that will give you the mindset that you need to succeed in sales or anything else. And then there's 8 skills in the back. So the reason the book is called The Only Sales Guide You'll Ever Need is because it's a pretty complete frame for how do you build yourself into the best salesperson that you can be and reach your potential in that game. And it's doing very well. You can find it just on any bookstore right now.
Cool. We'll link to that in the show notes over at salesman.red, and tell us where we can find out where we can find your blog as well.
thesalesblog.com, and I publish there every day and have for what will be 7 years at the end of this year.
Good stuff. Well, congratulations on that, the commitment. And with that, Anthony, I think we've covered some good ground here, mate. I think there's been some practical aspects of this. Hopefully, and this won't be all the listeners, but there'll be a good chunk of them that'll go, oh, this had made me feel a little bit weird. Maybe I need to up my game. And that's the first step to all of this, of course. So I appreciate that. I appreciate you being very candid with your answers. And I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And there we have it. Anthony, thank you for joining me on the show, mate. As always, super deep and interesting conversation. You're welcome back anytime. I want to thank you guys, Sales Nation. If you've enjoyed this episode, make sure you click subscribe and click that like button. Leave a comment below. I look through them all. I try my best to answer them. And with that all said, I'll speak with you again on tomorrow's episode.